I never intended to encounter something I couldn't explain. I moved to Alaska seeking isolation, a quiet place far from the chaos of the city. The cabin I found sat at the edge of a dense spruce forest, overlooking a frozen creek that reflected the dim winter sun. For the first few weeks it was peaceful, almost therapeutic. I could hear the snow settling, the occasional crack of a distant tree branch, and nothing else. That is, until the nights began to change. At first it was subtle. I noticed tracks in the snow, larger than any dog, elongated, almost humanoid. They led toward my cabin, then veered off into the woods. I questioned myself. Wolves roam here, but these weren't wolf tracks. The spacing was wrong, the gait unnatural. I found myself standing in the freezing cold, staring at these prints, trying to convince myself they were just an anomaly. That evening I double-checked the perimeter, gun in hand, flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched began to settle in, deep in my chest. A week later I woke to a low, guttural growl outside my window. I froze. The cabin was small, isolated, and my windows faced the forest directly. I held my breath, listening. The growl wasn't continuous. It was deliberate, measured, like it was observing me. I couldn't see anything at first. Then in the faint glow of the moon, I caught a glimpse. Tall, muscular, covered in dark fur, eyes reflecting the dim light, intelligent eyes. I blinked and it was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear? Maybe my mind was playing tricks. I even told myself that for a while. But then I started hearing footsteps on the snow around my cabin at night. Slow, heavy, always circling. The dogs I occasionally saw with hunters didn't move this way. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't consistent with anything I'd known. I began documenting everything. I labeled it Case File Number 1041 in my own handwriting, just to keep my mind grounded. I wrote down times, weather, snow conditions, distances, anything that could explain what was happening. By the end of the first month, I had accumulated dozens of entries, strange howls, fleeting shadows at the tree line, footprints that appeared and disappeared. The pattern suggested intelligence, planning even. It wasn't hunting yet, not directly. But it was watching, always watching. One evening I left the cabin to check the traps I had set for small game. The snow was knee-deep, the cold gnawing at my bones. As I walked toward the clearing, I sensed movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. And then I saw it, not far, maybe 50 feet away. The Dogman. Its posture was crouched, like a hunter, its eyes locked on me. There was no growl, no sound at all, just pure observation. I froze, unsure of whether to approach or retreat. I remember thinking, if I move, it might attack. If I stay, it might study me. I didn't know what to do. I raised my camera, the one I'd used for trail pictures, and snapped a shot. It moved too fast. The flash barely caught its outline. When I looked at the photo later, it was mostly darkness, a blur. But the shape was unmistakable. Humanoid form, long limbs, fur-covered body, sharp features. I shivered. I realized then that this wasn't a wolf or a bear. It was something else, something intelligent, something aware of me. The next days were worse. I began hearing whispers of movement at night, branches snapping, subtle rustling, the faint scrape of claws against wood. I checked the cabin thoroughly, sealing gaps, locking doors, and even tying ropes to make noise if someone or something entered. Nothing could prepare me for the sound of it sitting outside my door, growling softly, low and guttural, almost conversational. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to it move, planning, watching. At this point, I started leaving detailed reports in my case file. I cataloged behavior, the way it moved silently, the way it avoided traps, the intelligence behind every step. I noted the dates, the temperature, the moon phase, how close it came to the cabin each night. I was studying it as much as it was studying me. I also noticed patterns in its aggression. It never struck unless provoked, but it tested my presence. One night, it knocked over a pile of firewood outside. Another night, it scratched at the porch railing, leaving deep gouges. Once I left a piece of raw meat outside, a hunter's trap bait. The dogman took it but left without incident. It wasn't random. It was teaching me, testing my boundaries, maybe even communicating in its own way. I attempted audio recording. I left the microphone outside, hoping to capture its sounds without being present. I got growls, howls, even strange vocalizations that resembled human-like syllables, almost words. But they were distorted, low, guttural. No one I played them for could identify them. Not wolves, not bears, nothing normal. By the end of the second month, my sleep was almost non-existent. I began sleeping in bursts, always with the rifle nearby. I recorded every movement in the case file, detailing its intelligence, behavior, and reactions. The dogman had learned my routines, predicting when I left the cabin, when I went to sleep, even when I checked traps. It was methodical, deliberate, calculating. The breaking point came on a particularly dark night. I'd gone to check the creek, alone, without my rifle. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. When I returned, I noticed the footprints were closer to the cabin than ever before. I froze. My front door had faint scratches along the bottom edge. Inside, nothing had been moved, but the feeling of intrusion was absolute. I started leaving notes, recording observations in a running narrative as if the dogman could read my mind. I have learned to interpret small details. A bent branch could mean it had passed by. Snow displaced on the path could signal a return route. Sometimes I swear I see it in the distance, staring from tree lines. Its eyes are reflective, intelligent, calculating. There is a consciousness there I cannot comprehend, and I began to realize I was not just observing, it was observing me, waiting for me to react. It was during these observations I documented the first significant interaction. I had left a trail of food, hoping to lure it closer without confrontation. It came, and for the first time, we made direct contact. Standing 10 feet apart, eyes locked, it tilted its head, studied me, then walked slowly, deliberately, away into the darkness. I realized then it was aware of more than just my presence. It understood my intentions, my fear, and my hesitation. That night I wrote, "It is learning me as I learn it." From that moment, my case file grew exponentially. I documented every sensory detail, the sound of its breathing in the cold night, the faint smell of musk, the way it moved with predatory grace, the intelligence behind each action. Every page became a testament to a creature I could not classify, a creature that existed in a shadowed world parallel to mine. I began questioning my sanity, but every observation, every footprint, every fleeting glimpse confirmed it was real. By the end of Section 1, I had outlined a timeline spanning 2 months. First tracks, first sightings, first sounds, first direct interaction. My notes detailed everything in chronological order, emphasizing the intelligence, awareness, and growing audacity of the dogman. The creature was not simply surviving. It was assessing, learning, and adapting to my presence. It was no longer a distant threat. It had become a persistent, looming presence, and I knew the next encounter would not be passive. This concludes Section 1 of Case File Number 1041. In subsequent sections, I will detail the escalation of encounters, my attempts to communicate and protect myself, and the events that ultimately led to a terrifying confrontation. This file is my attempt to catalog reality as I experienced it. Every shadow, every sound, every calculated action of a dogman living near my cabin in Alaska. By the time I reached the 3rd month, I stopped asking myself whether it was real. That question had already been answered dozens of times over. The tracks, the sounds, the recordings, the physical damage around the cabin, none of it could be explained away anymore. What replaced doubt was something far worse: understanding, not complete understanding, but enough to recognize intent when I saw it. The dogman was no longer simply present. It was involved. The first sign came in the form of timing. I noticed that the disturbances around the cabin began occurring at very specific intervals. If I stepped outside at night, movement followed within minutes. If I stayed inside too long, the sounds grew louder, closer, more deliberate. It wasn't random curiosity, it was feedback. My actions were being monitored, and responses were calculated accordingly. I began changing my routine deliberately. I would leave the cabin at odd hours, sometimes late into the night, sometimes just before dawn. Each time, the forest reacted. Branches snapped in directions that cut off potential escape routes. Footprints appeared ahead of me, never directly behind. Once, after doubling back unexpectedly, I found a fresh set of tracks crossing my original path, as if it had anticipated my decision before I made it. I documented this carefully. Distance between prints, depth of impression, directional changes. I compared them to known wildlife behavior and found no match. Predators follow. This thing positioned. It didn't pursue blindly. It predicted. One night, I tested a theory that still unsettles me to this day. I walked halfway to the creek and stopped abruptly, standing motionless for nearly 20 minutes. I turned off my flashlight and waited. The forest remained silent longer than usual, almost as if holding its breath. Then, from my left, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow. Not rushing, not stalking in the traditional sense, just approaching at a measured pace. I turned my light back on and swept the tree line. Nothing visible, but the sound stopped instantly, as if it had frozen in place. I took a single step backward. The sound resumed. I stepped forward. Silence again. That was the moment I wrote the word control in my notes for the first time. It wasn't just reacting to me, it was influencing me. The physical signs escalated next. Deep scratches appeared along the outer wall of the cabin, higher than my head, running vertically as if something had tested the structure itself. The porch railing bore marks that looked like claw impressions, but more disturbing was the spacing between them. Too wide, too precise, almost measured. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, adding extra locks, boarding weak points, setting up noise traps around the perimeter. It avoided every single one. Lines I strung between trees remained untouched, while areas I hadn't considered showed clear signs of passage. Once, I found a carefully placed stick leaning against my door, angled in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. It wasn't blocking entry, it was signaling presence. Sleep became fragmented. I began experiencing moments where I couldn't tell whether sounds were external or imagined, but the recordings confirmed they were real. Low-frequency vocalizations occurred nightly, always between 1:40 and 2:30 a.m. The sounds were not howls. They were controlled, rhythmic, almost conversational. Sometimes they came from directly behind the cabin, other times from elevated ground, suggesting it was capable of positioning itself advantageously. The most unnerving realization came when I discovered evidence that it had been closer to me than I thought, much closer. I found footprints less than 5 feet from the cabin wall, overlapping older prints, indicating repeated visits to the same exact spot. Why that location? When I checked inside, I realized that spot aligned perfectly with where I slept. Whether by scent, sound, or something else entirely, it knew where I was at my most vulnerable. I attempted to assert boundaries. I fired a warning shot into the air one night after hearing it circle the cabin repeatedly. The sound echoed through the forest, and for a moment, everything went silent. I thought I had scared it away. I was wrong. The following night, the activity doubled. Footsteps surrounded the cabin from multiple directions. Vocalizations grew louder, closer. Not aggressive, but assertive. Almost offended. That's when I understood something critical. It didn't perceive me as prey, and it didn't perceive me as a threat. It perceived me as a variable that needed managing. I tried leaving offerings at a distance, hoping to redirect its focus away from the cabin. Raw meat, scraps, even objects carrying my scent. The items were taken, but the presence didn't diminish. If anything, it grew more confident. Tracks began appearing closer together, tighter circles, as if the perimeter it allowed me was shrinking. One night, during a heavy snowfall, I made a mistake. I followed the tracks. They led deep into the forest, weaving through dense trees, up a shallow incline, and into a natural clearing partially concealed by fallen timber. The tracks stopped abruptly at the center. No sign of departure, no disruption, just an absence. I realized too late that I had stepped into a place it used intentionally, a controlled space. The feeling of being watched intensified immediately. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I didn't run. I knew better. The return journey felt longer than it should have been, and when I reached the cabin, I found fresh tracks already waiting for me. It had returned before I had. That night, something changed. The distance it kept from the cabin closed significantly. I heard breathing outside my window for the first time, not growling, not vocalizing, just breathing, slow, heavy, deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my weapon. I lay still and waited until the sound eventually receded. In the case file, I marked this phase as proximity escalation. The Dogman was no longer content with observation alone. It was testing psychological pressure. It was measuring my reactions, my fear, my tolerance. Every decision I made fed into its understanding of me. I began to wonder how long it had been doing this to others, or if I was unique simply because I stayed. Most people would have left by now. That thought troubled me more than anything else, because staying might have been interpreted as consent. By the end of Section 2, the dynamic was clear. This was no accidental encounter, no fleeting glimpse of a wild anomaly. It was a sustained interaction between two intelligent beings sharing the same territory, and the balance was shifting. The Dogman was becoming bolder, more present, more involved in my daily existence. I wrote my final note for this section with shaking hands. Subject displays long-term strategic behavior. Interaction is ongoing. Withdrawal may no longer be an option. That was the moment I realized the situation was no longer under my control, and that whatever came next would not be passive. I stopped pretending the cabin was a barrier. That illusion disappeared the morning I found the marks on the roof. Not scratches, Not damage from falling branches, but compressed snow in a pattern that suggested weight had rested there deliberately, something heavy enough to bend the structure slightly, something that had chosen elevation over proximity. I stood in the cold for a long time, staring upward, imagining the line of sight from that angle. It would have been able to see straight through the window, directly to where I slept. From that day forward, every action I took felt observed in real time. If I lit the stove, movement followed. If I stayed inside too long, the pressure outside increased. Not noise, not aggression, presence. A calculated reminder that I was no longer alone, even when no sound could be heard. The forest had developed a rhythm, and I was no longer setting it. I began to notice something else. Something I hadn't recorded before because I didn't want to believe it. The Dogman wasn't always alone. There were nights when I heard movement that didn't match its gait, lighter but coordinated. I never saw more than one clearly, but the tracks told a different story. Parallel impressions, overlapping paths, brief convergence points before separation. Whatever this was, it wasn't solitary by nature. That realization shifted everything. Up until then, I had believed I was dealing with a single intelligence. Now I wasn't sure, and that uncertainty made every decision heavier. Leaving suddenly felt dangerous. Staying felt like a slow invitation to something I didn't understand. The first direct boundary violation happened without warning. I returned from checking traps just before dusk and found the cabin door slightly ajar. The lock hadn't been broken, it hadn't been forced, it had been disengaged. Inside nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, but the air felt wrong, stale in a way I couldn't explain. The smell hit me seconds later, musky, earthy, strong enough to override the wood smoke and oil scents I was used to. It had been inside. I documented everything with shaking hands. I photographed the latch, the doorframe, the floor. There were no clear footprints, but there were disturbances, subtle shifts in dirt, faint impressions where weight had transferred. Whoever or whatever entered had moved carefully, respectfully even. That was what disturbed me the most. It wasn't a raid, it was an inspection. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back against the wall, rifle across my lap, listening to the forest breathe. Around 2 a.m. the vocalizations began again, closer than ever. Not aggressive, low, measured, almost communicative. I couldn't understand them, but the cadence felt intentional, as if something was being explained rather than expressed. I made a mistake then. I responded, not verbally. I struck the cabin wall once with my hand, a single knock. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Everything stopped. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. The silence lasted long enough for panic to set in. Then, from directly outside the wall where I had knocked, I heard a single knock in return. It wasn't claws. It wasn't random impact. It was deliberate, controlled, equal in force to mine. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat there until dawn, replaying that moment over and over again, trying to rationalize it. But there was no rational explanation. Whatever this was, it had understood intent. It had mirrored behavior. It had acknowledged me. From that point forward, the encounters changed in tone. The Dogman no longer avoided being seen. I caught glimpses of it at the tree line in full daylight, standing upright, still, watching. Its posture was relaxed, confident, not threatening, not submissive, neutral. That neutrality terrified me more than aggression ever could. I began noticing changes in the surrounding wildlife. Birds vanished, small mammals disappeared. Even the usual distant sounds of larger animals faded. The forest felt hollowed out, as if everything else had learned to give this place a wide berth. I was the only one left who hadn't taken the hint. The pressure escalated gradually. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Tools left outside were relocated closer to the woods. Once I found my rifle repositioned where I hadn't left it. That incident shook me deeply. I couldn't prove it, but I knew I hadn't moved it. The implication was clear. It could enter, it could observe, and it could choose restraint. I started questioning my own presence there. Was I being tolerated, studied, prepared for something? I considered leaving multiple times, packing what I could, and abandoning the cabin altogether. But every time I prepared to do so, something happened that made me hesitate. Tracks blocking the path, movement in the distance, a sense that departure might provoke a response I wasn't ready for. The most unsettling encounter occurred during a storm. Heavy snow, limited visibility, wind howling through the trees. I thought the weather would provide cover, reduce activity. I was wrong. During the height of the storm, I heard footsteps on the roof again. Slow, heavy, intentional. Snow fell into the chimney as weight shifted above. Then came the sound of claws gripping wood. I shouted without thinking, a raw, instinctive outburst. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed. Then the breathing began, directly above me. Long, slow inhalations, no vocalization, just presence. I remember thinking that if it wanted to get inside, nothing I had would stop it. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought clarity. This wasn't a hunt. It wasn't a territorial dispute. It was something closer to evaluation, measurement. A prolonged assessment of behavior, response, resilience, and I was failing without knowing the criteria. The storm ended by morning. The roof was intact, no damage, no tracks, as if it had never been there at all. But I knew better. I could feel the shift. The escalation wasn't loud or violent. It was psychological, subtle, precise, like pressure applied gradually until something breaks. I wrote extensively that day, filling pages with observations, hypotheses, emotional responses. I questioned whether the Dogman perceived me as an anomaly in its environment, the way I perceived it. Whether my presence had disrupted a balance that predated me by years, decades, maybe longer. The idea that I was the intruder became harder to ignore. By the end of this period, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever rules governed this interaction were not mine. And whatever came next would not be accidental. The line between observer and participant had been crossed, and there was no going back to how things were before. I ended my notes with a single sentence, underlined twice. Subject no longer maintains distance. Intent remains unknown. The decision to stay was no longer mine alone. That realization settled in quietly, not as panic, but as resignation. Every attempt to assert control had been met with an adjustment from whatever was sharing this territory with me. Every boundary I thought I had drawn had been acknowledged, tested, and then subtly erased. The Dogman no longer behaved like an unknown variable. It behaved like a constant. I began noticing changes in myself before anything else escalated outward. My sleep patterns fractured completely. I stopped dreaming. When I did sleep, it was shallow, alert, interrupted by the slightest sound. My appetite dropped, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of anticipatory tension that never fully released. Even during daylight hours, I felt watched, not from a single direction, but from everywhere at once. The forest no longer felt like a place. It felt like a system. I tested the perimeter repeatedly, walking farther out each day, deliberately varying my routes. The Dogman allowed this. That was the unsettling part. It never blocked me outright. It never chased. It repositioned. If I veered east, movement appeared to the west. If I doubled back, I would find tracks already there, as if it had known I would change my mind before I did. The intelligence behind it was undeniable now, and worse, it was patient. One afternoon, I followed a game trail that I hadn't explored before, a narrow path winding through tightly packed spruce. Halfway through, the forest opened into a shallow depression, ringed by trees bent inward unnaturally, their trunks scarred at heights no animal should reach. The ground was compacted, snow pressed flat in overlapping patterns. This wasn't a resting spot. It was a meeting place. The smell hit me first, stronger than anything I had encountered before. It clung to the air, heavy and unmistakably organic. I realized then that I was standing in a space that was not meant for me. My presence felt intrusive in a way I hadn't experienced before, not threatening, offensive. I backed out slowly, carefully placing my feet in my own tracks. I didn't hear it follow me, but I knew I wasn't alone. That awareness had become second nature, like a second heartbeat running parallel to my own. When I returned to the cabin, the door was open again. This time, there was no ambiguity. Inside, something had changed. Objects were not scattered or damaged. They were arranged. My chair had been moved closer to the table. A notebook lay open to the last page I had written on. A piece of raw meat I had left frozen near the stove was gone, but in its place sat something else. A small animal bone, stripped clean, placed carefully at the center of the table. It was an exchange. I sat down without realizing it, my legs giving out beneath me. My mind raced, trying to understand the meaning behind the act. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't intimidation. It was communication. A message delivered in the only language it believed I might understand. I didn't touch the bone. I photographed it, documented its placement, its condition, the lack of blood, the precision of its positioning. My hands shook the entire time. That night I didn't barricade the door. I didn't set traps. I didn't attempt to assert control. I simply waited. The Dogman did not appear that night. Instead, I heard movement farther out than usual, multiple points of activity, overlapping paths, coordinated shifts. Whatever social structure existed beyond my understanding, I had been acknowledged within it. Not accepted, acknowledged. Days passed without escalation, but the tension grew heavier with each hour. The absence of immediate pressure felt intentional, like a pause in conversation rather than a retreat. I began noticing symbols in the environment that I couldn't ignore anymore. Branches snapped at specific angles, stones arranged in small clusters near the cabin perimeter, trails cleared and then obstructed again in patterns that defied coincidence. I tried to leave again. I packed only essentials, loading my vehicle quickly, heart pounding with every sound from the forest. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't linger. As soon as I turned the ignition, the forest reacted. Not with sound, but with movement. Shapes shifted at the tree line. Shadows crossed paths they hadn't before. The air felt thick, heavy, like walking into resistance. The engine stalled. I tried again. Nothing. Then I saw it, not charging, not hiding, standing directly in front of the vehicle just beyond the hood, fully upright, taller than I had imagined, broader. The proportions were wrong in a way that made my stomach drop. Its eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, assessing. There was no aggression in its posture, but there was authority. It raised one arm slowly, not threatening, not gesturing, simply present. I turned the engine off. The dogman lowered its arm, stepped aside, and disappeared into the trees. When I tried the engine again, it started immediately. I didn't leave. That moment broke something in me. Not my sanity, but my illusion of autonomy. Whatever rules governed this place, they were not negotiable. I began to understand that my survival thus far had not been accidental. It had been permitted. From that point forward, the encounters became more overt. I saw it regularly now, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at dusk, always at a distance it controlled, never closer than it wanted, never farther than it needed. It no longer avoided my gaze. When our eyes met, it held contact until I looked away. I began experiencing moments of profound disorientation. Time slipped unpredictably. Hours vanished, sounds distorted. I couldn't tell if these were stress responses or something else entirely. I recorded everything, obsessively, filling page after page with observations that felt more like confessions than data. One night I heard a new sound. Laughter, not human, not animal, something in between, low, breathy, rhythmic. It echoed through the trees, answered by another voice farther away. Whatever fear I had left crystallized into certainty. I was not dealing with a singular phenomenon. I was surrounded by a presence that had existed here long before me, structured, communicative, and deeply aware. The realization forced a choice I had been avoiding. I could no longer remain passive. I needed to either fully withdraw or fully engage. There was no middle ground left. The pressure had reached a threshold. I left the bone on the table overnight. In the morning it was gone. In its place lay a strip of bark carved with shallow marks. Not random, repeating, patterned. I traced them with my finger, trying to understand their meaning, knowing deep down that understanding might not be possible. This was not communication designed for me. It was acknowledgement that I was being addressed nonetheless. I documented the carving meticulously, photographing it from every angle. When I looked up, I saw movement at the tree line. The dogman stood there, watching, head tilted slightly, waiting. I did nothing. That was my response. The pressure did not ease, but it stabilized. I ended this portion of the record knowing that whatever happened next would not be subtle. The period of observation was over. The period of testing was nearing its end. Something was being prepared, and whether I wanted it or not, I was part of it now. I wrote my final note for this segment in deliberate, steady handwriting, forcing myself not to rush. Interaction has progressed beyond environmental overlap. Subject acknowledges presence and response. Next phase, imminent. I began measuring my days differently after that. Not by hours or light, but by proximity. How close it allowed me to move before the forest reacted. How long silence lasted before it became oppressive. How much pressure I could withstand before something responded. Survival stopped being about food or warmth and became about calibration. Every decision carried weight, and every mistake echoed longer than it should have. The first physical injury happened without warning. I was cutting wood near the edge of the clearing when a branch snapped above me. I looked up instinctively, just in time to see snow and debris cascade down. I slipped, my leg twisting awkwardly beneath me, pain flaring sharp and immediate. It wasn't severe, but it slowed me. And in this place, being slowed felt like blood in the water. I hadn't screamed, I hadn't called out. But within minutes I felt the shift. The forest tightened around me, sound dampening unnaturally. I struggled back toward the cabin, leaning heavily on the axe handle. Halfway there, I heard movement paralleling my path, not rushing, not closing distance aggressively, simply matching my pace. It knew I was injured. It knew exactly how much. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and slid down against it, breathing hard. The pain in my leg throbbed, but it was secondary to the realization settling in my chest. I had become vulnerable in a way I hadn't been before, and vulnerability had been noticed. That night was the first time it attempted to enter while I was awake. The handle turned slowly, testing, not forcing, just enough pressure to confirm resistance. Then it stopped. I waited, muscles tense, weapon useless in my hands. Minutes passed, then hours. No further attempt came. But the message was clear. It had learned how easily access could be gained if it chose to. In the days that followed, the dynamic shifted again. The Dogman began appearing closer, sometimes within 30 feet, standing partially obscured by trees but no longer hiding. Its posture remained calm, almost neutral, but the distance it maintained was no longer comfortable. It was closing in stages, deliberate and unhurried. I noticed details I hadn't allowed myself to see before. The structure of its face, elongated but expressive. The way its chest expanded and contracted with controlled breathing. The intelligence in its eyes, not animal, not human, something else, entirely. When it moved, it did so with an economy of motion that suggested deep familiarity with the terrain. Nothing wasted, nothing accidental. One evening I made a decision that still haunts me. I spoke aloud, not to challenge, not to threaten, just acknowledgement. I said a single sentence, my voice steady despite the fear running through me. I stated that I was aware of its presence and that I meant no harm. The words felt small in the vastness of the forest, inadequate and exposed. The response was immediate. From the trees came a low vocalization, deeper than anything I had recorded before. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't mocking, it was layered. Multiple tones overlapping in a way that made my head ache. It lasted only a few seconds, but the impact lingered. I realized then that speech, as I understood it, was not the primary method of communication here. Sound was only one component. That night I dreamed for the first time in weeks. The dream was vivid, oppressive. I stood in the clearing surrounded by trees bending inward. The Dogman stood before me, closer than ever, its eyes level with mine. It didn't speak, but I understood intent without words, not malice, not hunger, expectation. I woke with a start, heart racing, the sense of being watched unchanged. When I checked the door, I found fresh marks along the frame, deeper than before, closer together. It hadn't tried to break in, it had marked the boundary. From that point on, the interactions became increasingly intrusive. Tools vanished and reappeared in different locations. Food stores diminished without signs of forced entry. Once I found a trail of tracks, leading directly to my bed, and stopping there. No exit path, just presence and disappearance. I began to experience moments of dissociation, gaps in memory that I couldn't explain. I would find myself standing in the middle of the cabin, unsure how long I had been there. Pages appeared in my notebook that I didn't remember writing, filled with observations that were accurate but emotionally detached, as if recorded by someone else. The pressure culminated during a night I will never forget. A heavy fog rolled in unexpectedly, thick enough to swallow sound and light alike. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The forest felt closer, pressing in. I heard movement all around the cabin, multiple points, coordinated. Footsteps circled slowly, deliberately. Then came the vocalizations, overlapping, answering each other, building into something that felt ceremonial. The door rattled once, then again, not violently, rhythmically. I shouted for it to stop. The sound ceased instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I felt a presence on the other side of the door, close enough that I could sense its breath through the wood. Then came a single heavy knock, directly aligned with where my chest would be if I stood against the door. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The knock came again, harder this time. The structure creaked in response. I raised the rifle, hands shaking, knowing how futile it would be if the door gave way. Then everything stopped. No footsteps, no breathing, no sound at all. The fog lifted by morning, leaving the forest eerily still. When I stepped outside, I found deep impressions in the snow directly in front of the door, far larger than any tracks I had seen before. Multiple sets. They led away in different directions, dispersing into the trees. I knew then that whatever restraint had existed was thinning. The interactions were no longer just observational or psychological. They were becoming confrontational, testing my limits, probing for weakness. I wrote continuously that day, my handwriting erratic, my thoughts spiraling. I questioned whether I was being prepared for something, whether this was a process rather than an escalation toward violence. The idea that I was being conditioned unsettled me more than the threat of attack. Another attempt to leave ended abruptly when I found the road blocked by fallen trees that hadn't been there the day before. Fresh brakes, heavy force, deliberate placement. I turned back without hesitation. The message didn't need interpretation. That night, the Dogman approached closer than ever before. I saw it clearly in the moonlight, standing at the edge of the clearing, its form unmistakable. It took a single step forward, then stopped, its head tilted slightly, studying me. I felt exposed in a way I can't fully articulate, as if it could see not just my body, but my intent, my fear, my resolve. I didn't raise my weapon. I didn't speak. I stood there, hands empty, heart pounding, waiting. After a long moment, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees with a grace that felt almost dismissive. That was the night I understood that survival was no longer about defense. It was about compliance without surrender, about navigating an unspoken set of rules that I could only partially perceive. The balance was fragile, and I was constantly at risk of tipping it the wrong way. I ended this portion of the record with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The encounters were intensifying, the boundaries dissolving. Whatever came next would not be subtle, and it would not be optional. I wrote one final line before closing the notebook, my hands trembling despite my effort to stay calm. Containment has failed. Engagement is no longer avoidable. The night everything finally broke did not begin loudly. There was no warning, no dramatic shift in atmosphere. If anything, it felt unnervingly ordinary. The wind moved through the trees with the same low sigh I had grown accustomed to. Snow drifted lightly, muting the world. The cabin creaked as it always did when temperatures dropped. I remember thinking, briefly, that perhaps I had misjudged the trajectory of things, that maybe the pressure had peaked and would now recede. That thought did not last long. I woke just after midnight with the distinct sensation of weight pressing down on my chest. Not physical pressure, but something deeper, instinctive, the kind that triggers before the mind has time to rationalize. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged. I sat up slowly, listening. At first there was nothing. Then faintly, I heard movement beneath the floor, not outside, beneath. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, like something shifting weight against frozen earth. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The sound repeated, followed by a low vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and into my bones. The realization hit me all at once. I had been focused on the perimeter, on the walls, the door, the roof. I had never considered what lay below. The vibration stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. I stood, rifle in hand, and moved toward the center of the cabin. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then came the sound again, louder this time, accompanied by a deep, resonant exhale that felt less like a breath and more like a release of pressure. The floor creaked softly under my feet as I backed away, mind racing. There was no access point beneath the cabin, no crawl space large enough for anything to move through. Whatever was there had not arrived by accident. Then the smell came back, stronger than ever, filling the cabin with that unmistakable musk. I gagged, covering my mouth, eyes watering. The air felt alive, vibrating with presence. I realized then that the Dogman was not testing boundaries anymore. It was asserting them. The first impact came without warning. The cabin shuddered violently, a deep concussive force slamming into the underside of the structure. Dust rained down from the rafters. I stumbled, barely keeping my footing. The impact wasn't repeated immediately. It didn't need to be. The message was clear. This place was no longer secure. I shouted, not words, just raw sound, fear and adrenaline spilling out uncontrollably. The forest answered in kind. From every direction came vocalizations, overlapping, layered, building into a chorus that made my head spin. I dropped to my knees, hands pressed against my ears, but the sound wasn't just audible, it was visceral, vibrating through my chest, my skull, my thoughts. Then it stopped, abruptly, completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stayed frozen on the floor, waiting for the next impact, the next sound, anything. Minutes passed. My breathing slowed, though my hands continued to shake uncontrollably. I forced myself to stand to assess the damage. The cabin was intact, for now, no visible structural failure. But I knew it wouldn't withstand sustained force. That was when I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, heavy, unhurried. The handle turned once, twice. The door rattled violently as something tested it with far more strength than before. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, knowing how pointless it would be. The rattling stopped. I held my breath, muscles screaming from tension. Then came a sound I will never forget. Scraping, not claws, not wood. Something hard dragged slowly across the doorframe, deliberate and controlled, as if marking the surface. The sound sent a chill through me that no amount of cold ever could. This wasn't an attempt to enter. It was a warning. I did the only thing I could think to do. I spoke again. I don't remember the exact words. I know they were calm, measured, forced through clenched teeth. I stated my intent to leave, to abandon the cabin, to remove myself from the territory entirely. The words felt hollow even as I said them, but they were all I had left. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the scraping stopped. Footsteps retreated from the porch, moving back toward the tree line. The forest exhaled. The tension eased slightly, though it never disappeared entirely. I collapsed against the wall, exhausted beyond measure, knowing that whatever agreement had just been reached was fragile at best. I didn't sleep that night. I packed instead. At first light, I loaded everything I could carry into the vehicle, hands numb, mind focused solely on speed. I didn't look toward the forest. I didn't acknowledge the tracks I knew were there. I simply worked, driven by a singular goal: leave before the balance shifted again. The engine started without issue. I pulled away slowly, heart hammering, eyes scanning the trees. For several minutes nothing happened. The road stretched ahead, snow-covered but passable. Hope flared cautiously in my chest. Then the vehicle lurched violently to one side. I slammed on the brakes, heart in my throat. A massive tree had fallen across the road ahead, fresh, splintered, its weight blocking any chance of passage. I sat there, stunned, breath coming in short bursts. I didn't need to look behind me to know what I would see. But I did anyway. The Dogman stood in the road behind me, closer than ever before. There was no mistaking its size now, no room for denial. It filled the space effortlessly, its presence commanding, overwhelming. Its eyes met mine, unblinking. There was no hostility in its expression, but there was no negotiation either. This was not permission to leave. It took a single step forward, then another. I felt something inside me break, a final thread snapping under the weight of everything I had endured. Tears blurred my vision as I put the vehicle in reverse, retreating slowly, carefully, never taking my eyes off it. Only when I reached the clearing near the cabin did it stop advancing. It watched as I exited the vehicle, numb, defeated. It didn't move as I unloaded my supplies, as I returned them to the cabin one by one. It simply observed, its presence an unspoken verdict. When I closed the door for the final time, the Dogman turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as silently as it always had. That was the night I understood the truth I had been circling for months. This was not a place I could leave on my terms. Whatever intelligence governed this territory had already decided my role within it, at least for now. The following days blurred together. The pressure eased slightly, but the presence remained constant. The Dogman no longer needed to assert dominance. The hierarchy was established. I existed here by allowance alone. I wrote less after that. The case file entries became shorter, more restrained. There was only so much I could document without risking further escalation. I focused on survival, on maintaining the fragile equilibrium I had stumbled into. The fear never left, but it settled into something quieter, heavier. I don't know how long I remained there after that night. Time lost its meaning. Eventually, an opportunity to leave did present itself, though not in a way I can fully explain. When it did, I took it without hesitation, without looking back. I left the cabin behind. I left the forest. But I did not leave the experience. Even now, far from Alaska, far from that place, I still wake at night with the sensation of weight on my chest, of eyes watching from just beyond the light. I don't know if the Dogman followed me in any meaningful sense or if the imprint it left behind is purely psychological. What I do know is this: the intelligence I encountered was real, deliberate, and deeply territorial. It did not want me dead. It wanted me aware, and that awareness is something I will carry for the rest of my life. I didn't leave Alaska the way people imagine leaving a place like that. There was no dramatic escape, no final chase through the trees, no last glimpse of something standing on a ridge watching me go. When the opportunity came, it was quiet, almost mundane, which somehow made it worse. A supply pilot I'd met months earlier reached out unexpectedly, said he was flying near my area and could offer a ride out if I needed it. I said yes without asking questions, without negotiating timing. I didn't even pack everything. I took what I could carry and left the rest behind like offerings. The morning I left, the forest was still. Too still. No wind, no birds, no distant movement. It felt like being inside a held breath. As I locked the cabin door for the last time, my hands shook so badly I dropped the key into the snow. I didn't bother retrieving it. Some part of me understood that the cabin no longer belonged to me anyway. The pickup point was a small clearing several miles out. I walked the entire distance instead of driving, instinct telling me that the vehicle had already served its purpose. Every step felt watched. I didn't see anything, but the sensation followed me the entire way, a steady pressure between my shoulder blades, not predatory, supervisory. When the plane finally appeared overhead, the sound of the engine made me cry. Actual relief, sharp and painful, tore through me in a way I hadn't felt in months. As the pilot helped me aboard, I couldn't stop scanning the tree line. I expected, needed, to see something, some confirmation that what I'd lived through was real. There was nothing. As we lifted off, the forest fell away beneath us, endless and indifferent. I didn't feel victorious. I felt dismissed. For weeks afterward, I barely slept. When I did, my dreams were vivid and oppressive. I'd hear footsteps circling my bed, smell that musky odor in places it didn't belong, wake up convinced something massive was standing just out of sight. Rationally, I knew I was safe. Emotionally, my nervous system didn't get the message. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not friends, not family, not even the pilot who'd saved me. How do you explain something like that without sounding unhinged? I tried framing it as isolation-induced paranoia, stress hallucinations, sleep deprivation. But every attempt to reduce it fell apart under scrutiny. Too many details lined up. Too many moments where the behavior I observed was calculated, responsive, intelligent. Eventually, I contacted someone who'd been mentioned in an old forum post I'd saved months earlier. A researcher. Not a cryptozoologist in the sensational sense, but someone who quietly collected case files, testimonies, environmental data. He didn't laugh when I told him my story. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said something that sealed it for me. "You weren't supposed to stay." He explained that my account shared patterns with others he'd documented over decades. Remote dwellings, gradual escalation, territorial enforcement, and in rare cases, temporary tolerance. The creatures, Dogman, as people had come to call them, weren't random monsters roaming the woods. They were entrenched, adaptive, and deeply bound to specific regions. Encounters happened when human activity crossed invisible thresholds. "You crossed it," he said simply. "The reason my case file exists at all," he told me, "is because I survived long enough to document the full arc. Most people don't. They leave early, or they break psychologically, or something happens that ensures silence. My detailed notes, my timestamps, my refusal to dramatize what I couldn't prove, those made this record valuable." Still, even he cautioned against drawing firm conclusions. "We don't know what they are," he said, "only what they do." In the month since, I've moved twice. Not because I had to, but because staying in one place too long makes my skin crawl. I avoid forests now. Even parks unsettle me. I've learned to live with that. It's the cost of awareness. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd ignored the signs earlier, if I'd pushed harder, tried to dominate the space instead of coexist. I don't think I'd be here to wonder. This case file isn't a warning in the traditional sense. I'm not telling anyone to stay out of the woods forever. I'm saying that there are layers to wilderness we don't acknowledge, systems that predate us and don't recognize our assumptions of ownership. Some territories don't want to be discovered. Some intelligence prefers to remain myth. And sometimes, if you're unlucky or curious enough to linger, it will let you know exactly where you stand. That cabin is probably still there, or maybe it isn't. Either way, I won't go back to find out. Case file number 1041 was released because patterns matter and silence helps no one. Read it carefully, not for fear, for understanding, because if you ever feel watched in a place where you believe you're alone, the most important question isn't what's out there. It's whether you were invited to stay.